the American Civil War. The bloodiest war in American history wasn't fought on foreign soil. It was the American Civil War, lasting from 1861 to 1865, a conflict that tore the nation apart over slavery, states' rights, and the survival of the Union. Battles like Gettysburg, Antietam, and Shiloh left fields littered with the dead. Families were divided, entire towns destroyed, and the country itself nearly fractured beyond repair. For generations, the death toll was said to be about 620,000. But in 2011, historian J. David Hacker used census records to reveal a far higher number, closer to 750,000 lives lost. The National Park Service acknowledges both figures, but either way, the Civil War claimed more American lives than World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. The Union was preserved and slavery was abolished, yet the cost was almost unimaginable. Hundreds of thousands gone and a nation scarred forever. The Civil War was more than a fight for land. It was a battle for America's identity, and its consequences still shape the country today. World War II. On December 7, 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor brought the United States into World War II, the largest and deadliest overseas conflict in the nation's history. From 1941 to 1945, American forces fought across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific. They stormed the beaches of Normandy, battled through the Ardennes, and endured brutal island campaigns from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima. The human cost was immense. According to the Congressional Research Service, 405,399 American service members lost their lives in the war. Millions more served, many returning home wounded or forever changed by what they had witnessed. In May 1945, Germany surrendered. 3 months later, Japan capitulated after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, officially ending the war in September. World War II left the United States with devastating losses, but it also reshaped its future. The nation emerged as a global superpower, and the sacrifices of those who served remain etched into history as the price of victory. World War I, once called the Great War, marked the first time the United States entered a massive European conflict. From April 1917 to November 1918, American soldiers crossed the Atlantic and faced the horrors of modern warfare head-on. In just 19 months, the toll was staggering. 116,516 Americans died. Of these, more than 53,000 were killed in combat, while over 63,000 perished from disease, with the influenza pandemic devastating crowded camps as much as enemy fire. Battles like Belleau Wood, Saint-Mihiel, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive became brutal proving grounds, where U.S. troops endured machine guns, poison gas, and relentless artillery. Each fight pushed America deeper into the center of global power. When the guns finally fell silent on November 11, 1918, the war had ended, but at an immense cost. In less than 2 years, more Americans had died in World War I than in the entire Vietnam War decades later. Their sacrifice transformed the United States, proving it could never again remain apart from world affairs, and reminding us how steep the price of global conflict can be. Please don't forget to support my channel by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you. The Vietnam War, fought from 1955 to 1975, remains one of the deadliest and most divisive wars in U.S. history. What began as American military advisors supporting South Vietnam against communist North Vietnam escalated into a full-scale conflict. By 1965, more than 180,000 U.S. troops were deployed, a number that swelled to over 500,000 by the late 1960s. The fighting was relentless. Dense jungles, ambush tactics, and guerrilla warfare claimed thousands of lives. In total, 58,220 American service members were killed, with 47,434 dying in battle and thousands more from non-combat causes. Another 150,000 were wounded, and countless veterans carried invisible scars long after returning home. Beyond the battlefield, the war split the United States itself, igniting protests, toppling political careers, and leaving deep distrust in government. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell to North Vietnamese forces. The desperate helicopter evacuations from the U.S. Embassy became the lasting image of America's withdrawal. The Vietnam War ended in defeat, but its impact endures, etched in memorial walls, in the lives of survivors, and in the lessons America still grapples with today. The Korean War, fought from 1950 to 1953, is often called the Forgotten War. Yet for the United States, it claimed a devastating toll: 36,574 American lives. It began on June 25, 1950, when North Korean troops, supported by the Soviet Union, crossed the 38th parallel into South Korea. The United States, under the United Nations command, entered the conflict, committing millions of troops to a war of staggering intensity. From the frozen battlefields of the Chosin Reservoir, where U.S. Marines fought against overwhelming Chinese forces in brutal sub-zero conditions, to the repeated clashes over the capital city of Seoul, the war became a punishing struggle marked by relentless bloodshed. On July 27, 1953, an armistice was signed, but a peace treaty was never concluded. The Korean peninsula remains divided to this day, its scars still visible, and the United States left mourning tens of thousands of fallen service members. The Korean War may not command the same attention as other conflicts, but its cost in lives ensures it remains one of the deadliest wars in American history. The American Revolutionary War, fought from 1775 to 1783, was the struggle that gave birth to the United States. From the opening shots at Lexington and Concord to the decisive surrender at Yorktown, the colonies fought not only the British Army, but hunger, disease, and exhaustion. The human cost was devastating. Roughly 25,000 Americans died, about 6,800 killed in battle, and nearly 17,000 lost to disease, according to estimates cited by the Congressional Research Service, the Department of Veterans Affairs, and historical analysis summarized by Snopes. For 8 years, soldiers endured brutal winters, scarce supplies, and relentless combat, driven by the promise of independence. The war officially ended with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, recorded in the National Archives, which recognized the sovereignty of a new nation. Freedom was won, but at the price of tens of thousands of lives. War of 1812. In the year 1812, a young United States declared war on Britain, driven by anger over trade restrictions, the seizure of American sailors, and British support for native resistance. What followed was a 3-year struggle that tested the nation's very survival. Fighting stretched across the Canadian frontier, the Atlantic coast, and the Gulf of Mexico. More than 15,000 Americans lost their lives, many not on the battlefield, but to disease, which struck harder than gunfire or cannon shot. In 1814, British forces captured Washington, D.C., burning the Capitol and the White House, a humiliation that shook the country. Yet the spirit of resistance held firm. Just months later, at the Battle of New Orleans, General Andrew Jackson led a smaller force to a stunning victory, igniting national pride, even though peace had already been secured with the Treaty of Ghent. The War of 1812 became known as America's Second War of Independence. It did not redraw borders, but it secured respect for the United States on the world stage and left behind a legacy of sacrifice, resilience, and emerging national identity. Mexican-American War. In 1846, a border dispute along the Rio Grande erupted into the Mexican-American War, a conflict that would redraw the map of North America. For 2 years, U.S. and Mexican armies clashed in deserts, mountains, and cities. Battles like Buena Vista and the storming of Chapultepec Castle became symbols of ferocious fighting. By the war's end in 1848, Mexico was forced to sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ceding nearly half its territory, land that would become California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. Yet the triumph came at a heavy cost. 13,283 U.S. soldiers died, most not from combat, but from disease that swept through camps and battle lines. Tens of thousands of Mexican lives were lost as well, leaving scars across both nations. The war expanded America's borders, but it also deepened divisions at home, divisions that would soon explode in the Civil War. The Mexican-American War remains one of the deadliest forgotten wars in U.S. history, a reminder that conquest always comes with sacrifice. Iraq War. In March 2003, the United States launched Operation Iraqi Freedom, invading Iraq to remove Saddam Hussein from power. Baghdad fell quickly, but the conflict was only beginning. Insurgent groups rose almost immediately. Roadside bombs, or IEDs, became the deadliest threat to American troops. Battles raged in places like Fallujah and Mosul, turning neighborhoods into war zones and pushing U.S. forces into years of relentless combat. By 2010, the mission shifted to Operation New Dawn, focused on training Iraqi forces and drawing down the U.S. presence. Yet violence continued, and American troops remained in harm's way. According to the Department of Defense casualty records, the toll was devastating. 4,493 U.S. service members killed, 4,419 during Operation Iraqi Freedom, and 74 during Operation New Dawn. Each loss marked a soldier's final sacrifice in a war that lasted until December 2011. The Iraq War remains one of the most controversial U.S. conflicts of the 21st century, remembered for both its cost in lives and the enduring debate over why it was fought. Philippine-American War. In 1899, the United States found itself in a new war, this time against the very people it had promised to liberate. The Philippine-American War erupted after Filipino revolutionaries, fresh from fighting Spain, refused to accept U.S. control. What followed was a brutal conflict of pitched battles and relentless guerrilla warfare. For American troops, the tropical climate, disease, and unfamiliar terrain proved as deadly as the enemy itself. By the official end in 1902, more than 4,200 U.S. soldiers were dead. Filipino losses were far greater, with hundreds of thousands killed through combat, famine, and disease. Resistance, however, continued in some regions until 1913. Though overshadowed by later wars, the Philippine-American War was one of the bloodiest episodes of America's overseas expansion, an early test of a rising power, paid for with staggering human cost. Spanish-American War. In 1898, the United States entered its first major overseas war, the Spanish-American War. It began after the explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor, an event that fueled public outrage and calls for intervention against Spain. The fighting was swift but fierce. American forces clashed with Spain in Cuba, Puerto Rico, and across the Pacific in the Philippines. Victories like the Battle of San Juan Hill and Admiral Dewey's triumph at Manila Bay reshaped the nation's confidence on the world stage. Yet the greatest enemy wasn't always Spain. Disease swept through the ranks, claiming far more lives than combat itself. Out of 2,446 American deaths, only about 400 were from battle. The rest were lost to yellow fever, typhoid, and malaria in the tropical camps. By December 1898, the Treaty of Paris ended the war. Spain surrendered its colonies, handing Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. The conflict was brief, but its toll was heavy, and it marked the moment America stepped onto the path of global power: war in Afghanistan. On September 11, 2001, terror struck the United States. Within weeks, American forces launched Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, aiming to dismantle al-Qaeda and topple the Taliban regime that sheltered them. What began as a swift intervention turned into the longest war in U.S. history. Soldiers fought across rugged mountains, deserts, and cities, facing an enemy that adapted at every turn. From 2001 to 2014, under Operation Enduring Freedom, 2,219 U.S. service members lost their lives. When the mission shifted to Operation Freedom Sentinel in 2015, another 109 Americans were killed. By the final withdrawal in August 2021, the toll stood at 2,328. The cost reached into the trillions, reshaping U.S. foreign policy and leaving Afghanistan once again under Taliban control. After 2 decades of sacrifice, the question still lingers: what was truly gained? The Second Seminole War, fought from 1835 to 1842, was one of the longest and deadliest conflicts ever waged between the United States and Native Americans. It erupted in Florida when the Seminoles refused to surrender their land and relocate west. What followed was a brutal war in the swamps and forests, guerrilla-style ambushes, night raids, and endless skirmishes that wore down U.S. forces. But the greatest killer wasn't always combat. Disease tore through the ranks, claiming about 1,466 lives, while another 328 soldiers were killed in battle. In total, nearly 1,800 Americans died during the 7-year struggle. Despite enormous costs, the war ended without a decisive U.S. victory. Many Seminoles were forced west, yet a small band endured, retreating deep into the Everglades, where they remained unconquered. The conflict revealed a hard truth. Even the strongest army can be undone not only by an enemy's resistance, but by the unforgiving land itself. Persian Gulf War. In August 1990, Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait, setting off a crisis that would draw the United States and a global coalition into war. By January 1991, Operation Desert Storm was underway, an intense air campaign followed by a swift ground assault. For 42 days, coalition forces bombarded Iraqi positions, crippling their command and supply lines. When ground troops advanced on February 24th, the fighting lasted just 100 hours before Kuwait was liberated. The war was brief, but not without sacrifice. According to reports, 383 American service members lost their lives during the Persian Gulf War, a conflict that reshaped modern warfare with the widespread use of precision-guided weapons and advanced technology. Though remembered as a decisive victory, its cost is carried in the memory of every family that never saw their loved ones return. Lebanon peacekeeping. In 1982, U.S. Marines landed in Lebanon as part of a multinational peacekeeping force, sent to stabilize a nation torn by civil war. Their mission was meant to be temporary, keeping peace, not waging war. But on October 23, 1983, tragedy struck. A suicide bomber drove a truck packed with explosives into the Marine barracks in Beirut. In an instant, the building collapsed, killing 241 American service members. It was the deadliest single attack on U.S. Marines since World War II. The shock reverberated across the United States and the world, raising hard questions about America's role in conflicts far from home. By 1984, U.S. forces withdrew from Lebanon. In all, 265 Americans lost their lives during the peacekeeping mission, turning an operation built on hope into one of the deadliest chapters in modern U.S. military history. Boxer Rebellion. In 1900, a violent uprising shook China, the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers, a secret society opposed to foreign influence, attacked missionaries, Chinese Christians, and Western communities, eventually laying siege to the foreign legations in Beijing. The United States, though distant, joined an international coalition known as the China Relief Expedition. American soldiers and Marines fought alongside British, Japanese, German, and other troops, marching inland to rescue those trapped in the capital. The battles were brutal. In August, U.S. Marines stormed Beijing's gates, helping to lift the siege after weeks of desperate fighting. But victory came at a cost. About 131 American servicemen lost their lives in the campaign, a striking figure for a war many back home barely followed. Though brief, the Boxer Rebellion was a turning point. It marked the first time U.S. troops fought in coalition on Chinese soil, signaling America's growing reach on the world stage and showing that even distant conflicts could exact a deadly price. Operation Inherent Resolve began in August 2014 when the United States and its allies launched a campaign against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. At its peak, ISIS controlled vast stretches of territory, enforcing its rule with brutal violence and threatening regional stability. The U.S. military returned to a battlefield it had left only a few years before, this time leading relentless airstrikes and special operations missions. Coalition forces partnered with Iraqi troops and Syrian fighters, battling street by street in cities like Mosul and Raqqa to dismantle the so-called caliphate. By January 30, 2025, the mission had claimed the lives of 118 U.S. service members. Each loss marked the ongoing cost of containing an extremist threat that has refused to vanish entirely. Though ISIS lost its strongholds, Operation Inherent Resolve continues to this day, reminding the world that even after the fall of a caliphate, the fight against terrorism is never truly over. Operation Restore Hope. In the early 1990s, Somalia was a nation in collapse. Civil war, famine, and lawlessness left millions at risk. In December 1992, the United States launched Operation Restore Hope, sending thousands of troops to protect humanitarian aid convoys and restore order. At first, the mission was about food and relief, but by 1993, American forces were drawn into direct conflict with militias loyal to warlord Mohammed Farah Aidid. The turning point came on October 3, 1993, when U.S. Rangers and Special Operations Forces attempted to capture Aidid's lieutenants in Mogadishu. 2 Black Hawk helicopters were shot down, and a routine mission turned into a brutal urban battle. For nearly 18 hours, American soldiers fought block by block against overwhelming numbers. 18 were killed in a single day, their sacrifice broadcast in harrowing images around the world. By the time the U.S. withdrew in 1994, 43 American service members had died in Somalia. What began as a humanitarian effort ended in tragedy, leaving a lasting debate over the limits of U.S. military intervention, Operation Just Cause. December 1989, Operation Just Cause. The United States launched a sudden invasion of Panama to remove General Manuel Noriega, accused of drug trafficking, election fraud, and violent repression. In the early hours of December 20th, more than 27,000 U.S. troops, supported by aircraft and special forces, struck Panamanian military bases, airfields, and command centers. Panama's defense forces resisted in pockets of Panama City, and fighting spilled into crowded neighborhoods, where civilians were caught in the crossfire. Within days, U.S. forces secured the Comandancia, Tocumen Airport, and the Canal Zone. But the cost was real. 23 American service members were killed, alongside hundreds of Panamanian soldiers and civilians. Noriega fled to the Vatican Embassy, where U.S. troops surrounded him and blasted loud music day and night. On January 3, 1990, he surrendered, bringing his regime to an end. Operation Urgent Fury. October 25, 1983. Before sunrise, U.S. forces stormed the Caribbean island of Grenada in Operation Urgent Fury. Their mission was clear: remove a Marxist military junta that had seized power in a bloody coup and protect nearly 600 American medical students caught in the unrest. Army Rangers parachuted onto the island, Marines landed from the sea, and Navy SEALs and Air Force units joined in a fast-moving assault. But resistance was tougher than expected. Grenadian troops and hundreds of Cuban soldiers fought back fiercely, defending a large airstrip that U.S. leaders feared could serve Soviet expansion in the region. Confusion, poor communication, and heavy fire turned the short campaign into a costly fight. In just over a week of combat, 19 Americans were killed and more than 100 were wounded. Cuban and Grenadian casualties were higher, but U.S. forces secured control of the island. By November 3rd, the coup leaders were captured, the students were evacuated, and Grenada was placed back under civilian rule. Operation Urgent Fury was brief, but it carried a lasting message. Even small wars can exact a deadly toll. If you enjoyed this video, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.